For more than a century, vampire and werewolf films have functioned as a dark mirror to the human condition by constantly evolving alongside the fears, desires, and anxieties of the societies that create them. These creatures began as expressions of folklore and superstition by embodying fears like death, disease, and the unknown, but over time they transformed into complex enigmas reflecting war trauma, sexual repression, identity crises, and the terror of losing control. As the course of filmmaking advanced in the last 100 years, so too did these monsters as they moved from being shadowy Gothic nightmares to psychologically rich characters shaped by science, philosophy, and shifting moral codes. Vampires became symbols of temptation, immortality, and power, while werewolves captured the horror of fractured identity and the violence lurking beneath civility. Each era reshaped them through new lenses, starting from expressionist dread, post-war paranoia, counter-cultural rebellion, and modern existential unease. What makes these films still work today is their adaptability, as they refuse to stay static by feeding on new ideas, just as their creatures feed on blood or flesh. Across the generations, these stories have pushed technical boundaries, redefined horror aesthetics, and blurred the line between monster and human. Together, they form a cinematic lineage that charts not only the evolution of genre filmmaking, but also the shifting fears of society itself. Having said that, let's discuss our picks for the top 19 vampire and werewolf movies that have become masterpieces in the last 100 years. Let's get into it. The Howling, 1981. In Joe Dante's The Howling, we meet a television news anchor named Karen White who's traumatized after a horrifying encounter with a serial killer named Eddie Quist. After a nervous breakdown, Karen checks into a remote therapeutic colony, only to find out that the residents are hiding a savage lycanthropic secret. The film bounces between psychological thriller and shock-heavy horror while using Karen's declining mental health as our map into a community that camouflages their primal instinct with a seemingly normal suburban life. Now, what'll really surprise you is that the screenplay balances subtle black comedy with the body horror as the tension crescendos into a climactic transformation sequence that'll startle you to this day. However, credit where credit is due, because half the brilliance of this film comes from Rob Bottin's extraordinary practical makeup work with gory, inventive prosthetics, mechanical rigs, and in-camera slights that were apparently executed under intense deadlines. Given that The Howling is from the early 80s, digital effects are minimal here with the use of optical tricks, stop-motion style edits, and careful shot composition instead of modern CGI, further giving the metamorphosis an unsettling immediacy. This tactical approach makes The Howling's werewolves feel unnervingly real. The film also leans more towards being a social commentary because the werewolves here are simple suburban citizens whose polite facades fracture into animal violence in the dead of the night. Not just that, Dante's wolves are sly, often amusing, and disturbingly human, which, pun intended, deepens the film's satirical bite, especially because it ends with Karen trying to prove her story to the world by transforming into a werewolf on live broadcast, with her friend waiting with a gun to shoot her right after it's done. Sadly, the world watching believes this to be a fun stunt and simply laughs as Karen is put down. Having said that, if you love analog-era effects or want to watch a werewolf movie that bites with both teeth and wit, The Howling will definitely be your jam.
You serve the cross. I who commanded nations.
Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992. Now, come to the vampire movie of the millennia, the iconic Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula is less a conventional horror film and more of a tragic Gothic opera about love, damnation, and immortality. The story reframes that classic vampire myth as a doomed romance through a cursed vampiric nobleman who believed that his long-dead wife was reincarnated in a young Victorian woman engaged to another man. The emotional core of Bram Stoker's Dracula moves between crumbling castles, candlelit chambers, mist-filled streets, and blood-soaked rituals that create a dreamlike world where the concept of desire and terror constantly overlap. Dracula isn't simply a predator here, but a grieving immortal, driven as much by heartbreak as by hunger, which gives the story a strange emotional gravity. Now, what makes this vampire radically different from other monster films isn't just his emotional depth, but the fact that he's not exactly a seductive aristocrat or a mindless monster. Rather, he's a tragic entity or a fallen man who chose damnation for love and lives with that curse for centuries. Having said that, Bram Stoker's Dracula low-key managed to revive big-budget Gothic horror in mainstream cinema because it not only gave a new meaning to how literary adaptations could be visually bold, but also proved that horror could be romantic, operatic, and art-driven without losing its darkness. The Wolfman, 1941. The Wolfman tells a deceptively simple story that became the emotional blueprint for every werewolf film that followed since the 40s. When a man named Larry Talbot returned to his ancestral home in Wales after many years, he hoped to reconnect with his estranged father and reclaim some sense of belonging. But instead, a violent encounter on a foggy night left him cursed, which he slowly realized after coming under the light of a full moon, which transformed him into a killer beast he could not control. From there on, the Wolfman becomes a dreadful story of shame as Larry knows what he's becoming, and that knowledge, by extension, becomes the true horror because his doom seems inevitable. Having said that, the film's effects were groundbreaking for their time because, this is the 40s we're talking about. Jack Pierce's practical makeup was applied layer by layer, creating the illusion of the classic werewolf transformation using dissolves and meticulous staging. Of course, there's no CGI here, meaning every effect is done physically, which makes it deliberately rooted in theatrical craft. While The Wolfman goes through a lot of interpretations in later years, what really makes it a classic is how it upholds a sense of tragedy in a man losing himself to the beast he transforms into. Larry Talbot isn't a savage villain or a power fantasy, he's just a doomed man who's crushed by utter guilt and fear. The film treats this curse as an illness or even a metaphor for loss of control long before horror films openly explored such deep themes. Now, the reason why his wolf form isn't sleek or heroic is that it's shown to be heavy, tortured, and unmistakably human beneath the fur. However, the impact of the Wolfman on global cinema cannot be overstated because it literally defined the core of all werewolf mythology, starting with the silver bullets, full moons, and inherited curses. Through Lon Chaney Jr., the monster gained a soul, and that emotional foundation still reverberates through modern horror because nearly a century later, Larry Talbot's howl remains one of cinema's saddest. Blade, 1998. Every true Marvel fan has seen Blade, and nobody cheered louder than us when Wesley Snipes' Blade made his cameo in Deadpool vs. Wolverine. Back in the day, though, Blade arrived like a thunderclap who didn't open with Gothic castles or candlelight, but with a nightclub soaked in blood and strobe lights. It was a revelation, and the story basically focuses on a half-vampire, half-human hunter who is raised to wipe out the creatures that prey on humanity, including the secret society that controls the modern world from the shadows. What follows is a fast and aggressive collision of horror and martial arts adapted straight from the comics, where we basically witness ancient vampire politics clashing with the late 90s urban grit. Instead of treating vampirism as a curse or a tragedy, the film makes a predatory disease out of it while making Blade its angriest cure. Given the use of early CGI, the digital elements are definitely rough by today's standards, but even then, Blade as a vampire-human hybrid is radically different from what we usually see in vampire films. Even the monsters he fights aren't seductive aristocrats or tortured poets. In fact, they're corporate monsters, scientists, mob bosses, and predators hiding in plain sight. Blade himself is equally unconventional as a vampire who can walk in the daylight, feels pain, rage, and isolation, but refuses to revel in self-pity. He's not at all romanticized, nor is he a monster, but a tactical superhero who's super brutal and determined to fulfill his purpose. We really think that people often underestimate this film because, in our opinion, it proved that comic book films could also be violent, stylish, and commercially viable before the modern superhero boom. Underworld film series. Now, I'm pretty sure most of you have binged this one a couple of times, but in case you haven't, the Underworld films revolve around Celine, a very hot, leather-clad vampire death dealer who's caught up in an ancient secret war with the Lycans. And yep, you guessed right, the Lycans are the franchise's werewolf-like creatures whose existence is tied to a plague-like mutation and a buried family lineage. Across 5 main films, the story hops between a couple of different places, starting with present-day action and Celine's hunt, to a relationship with the human-turned-hybrid Michael Corvin, the tragic uprising led by Lucian, and of course, the later entries where humans learn the truth about these Lycans, thus leading to a situation where both species are forced to adapt to the current scenario. What makes the Lycans different here is the entire backstory, because rather than the usual moon lore, we witness them as a distinct evolution-driven faction with a social structure that has legit soldiers and leaders, instead of having a pack full of cursed beings who transform on a full moon. The fun part is that the franchise will occasionally make you sympathize with them, especially in the prequel that sort of reframes the war as a rebellion, thus making them more martyrs than they are monsters. Even the vampires in Underworld were depicted as militarized elites who function as organized soldiers and political rulers under a certain hierarchy of bloodlines and power struggles that are centuries old. As they're living in a modern industrial world, these vamps use guns, modern technology, and more tactical warfare rather than Gothic rituals or dark magic. However, the concept of emotion here is treated as a weakness and not a poetic burden, which makes characters like Celine stand out when they begin to question authority, which is exactly what makes this series all the more binge-worthy. Nosferatu, 1922. Nosferatu is an iconic silent German expressionist vampire film that low-key shakes you down like a slow, inexorable fever dream and is told through silent performances and stark images. The film follows a naive clerk named Thomas Hutter who's summoned by a mysterious nobleman named Count Orlok to the Carpathian Mountains in order to finalize a property deal, and in doing so, he carries back something that puts his ordinary life in shambles. As the Count travels to Hutter's hometown of Wiesberg, he brings a plague-like death through a swarm of rats. The film ends with Hutter's wife, Ellen, sacrificing herself to distract Orlok until the sun rises, causing him to vanish in the light, which was the first time that sunlight was depicted as lethal to vampires in cinema. Having said that, in Nosferatu, Count Orlok is nothing like the suave or romantic vamps we know today. In fact, he's skeletal, rodent-jawed, and just undeniably uncanny. The film's inversion of turning the concept of vampirism into a metaphor for plague rather than passion gave the foundation of the creature a terrifying clarity. Not just that, but technically, the film's aesthetic innovations shaped the horror language. Take the famous scene of Orlok's shadow climbing a staircase, for example, as it has become an archetype for cinematic dread. Even the movie's afterlife is as notable as the film itself, because despite legal tussles and attempts to suppress it, Nosferatu survived and seeded generations of film. In a way, its ugliness and atmosphere forced creators to rethink what a blood-sucking monster could mean in a human world. Twilight film series. Over the years, you've either hated Twilight or loved it, but one thing's for certain, you could not have avoided the discussion started by this series. All 5 movies in the Twilight saga recast the concept of vampires and werewolves as objects of absolute yearning by smushing the same old concept into a teen melodrama setting. The Twilight series is an absolute guilty pleasure for the very same reason. Here, we meet extremely pale but impossibly beautiful immortals who, unlike the classic vampires, don't burn in sunlight, and their monstrous appetites here are seen as moral choices. Ironically, the Cullen's vegetarian code of avoiding human blood turns the idea of predation into ethics, while vampiric adolescence becomes a metaphor for puberty, control, and desire. Fun stuff, right? I mean, that moral sanitization makes them protectors and paramours instead of predators. And when Bella ends up choosing vampirism for herself, she's framed as someone who's gaining power through love instead of losing her humanity to horror. The same goes for the werewolves, who, unlike their classic counterparts, don't transform uncontrollably during a full moon, but can rather change at will. Their transformation is mostly tied to their rage and their tribal lineage instead of lunar cycles or a supernatural curse. In fact, They act as guardians of their land and usually use their wolf form against vampires. There's no silver bullet mythology for werewolves in the Twilight saga, and to add a cherry to that cake, even in wolf form, these werewolves get to keep their consciousness intact while also being able to telepathically communicate with their pack. But the bolder choice here was how the films traded the usual Gothic dread we see in this genre for polished YA aesthetics with moody skies, glossy wardrobes, and slow-burn romantic longing. The series also plays with hybrid identity, which complicates the genre's usual binary of monster versus human and opens up new avenues for fantasies about immortality, safety, and eternal romance. Maybe 10 years from now, if another person as crazy as Stephanie Meyers turns out, we'll get to see a sequel about the next generation of hybrids, because literally anything is possible in the Twilight saga. Jokes aside, Twilight was seismic as it launched a wave of young adult adaptations, exploded fan culture, and propelled its actors and soundtrack to fixtures of pop radio and tabloids. It normalized a softer romantic vampire archetype that dominated media in the 2010s and shifted mainstream tastes away from horror towards relationship-driven supernatural drama. Whether loved or lampooned, the Twilight films sort of rewired vampire and werewolf mythology for a generation by turning bloodsuckers into boyfriends, monsters into metaphors, and the undead into a cultural phenomenon that changed teen storytelling for years to come. An American Werewolf in London, 1981. An American Werewolf in London is a comedy horror film with a sharp sense of humor and a surprising glimpse of vulnerability. The story follows two American backpackers, David Kessler and Jack Goodman, as they trek through the North York moors, where a vicious wild dog attacks them during the night, mauling Jack to death and seriously injuring David. After 3 weeks, when David wakes up, he blames the incident on the rabid dog, but then, when Jack shows up in an undead form, he informs David that they were actually attacked by a werewolf. Turns out, Jack had already transformed, but David still had time because even if he was bitten, his transformation wouldn't happen until the next full moon. Here, the werewolves cannot die until the wolf's entire bloodline is severed, so Jack urges David to unalive himself before his transformation so he never finds himself hurting anyone. Well, we all know how these things go, so as he begins to transform, the film changes gears from mystery to full-blown nightmare, but it does so without ever losing its dark wit. What makes it really stick is the contrast between ordinary, almost casual conversation and the grotesque horror closing in around it. Now, the werewolf here is very different from the usual movie monster, as it's not just a savage animal lurking in the woods. The transformation is treated more like torture instead of spectacle, and that gives the whole story a shocking intensity. Instead of leaning on mystery or folklore alone, the film makes the curse feel immediate and brutal, almost like the body itself is betraying the person inside it, making the overall film just deeply tragic and physically painful. But the practical effects are actually the real legend of the film, because the transformation scene, built with prosthetics and in-camera effects, remains one of the most famous in horror history. CGI is basically not much of a factor here, and that's part of why this movie still works so well if you ask us. Everything just feels real, messy, and awful in the best possible way. Dracula Untold, 2014. This particular film chooses to focus on Dracula being more of a tragic warrior than the usual vamp, as we follow Vlad, a ruler pushed to make impossible choices when the consequences of war threaten his people and his family. Instead of making him a mysterious predator in a castle, the film gives him a human wound at the center of everything. He becomes a monster only because he believes it's the only way to protect what he loves. That shift gives the familiar legend a more emotional and almost heroic tone, but what really makes this version of Dracula different from the usual movie vamp is that he's not simply seductive, evil, or even fully villainous. In fact, he's a battlefield-driven anti-hero, a man whose power comes from sacrifice, rage, and grief. If you've watched the film, you already know how it embraces the monster's superhuman speed, bat-like swarms, and dark combat imagery, but still presents those traits as extensions of a broken soul rather than making it exist just for Gothic flair. If you think about it, Dracula Untold fits a bigger cultural trend of turning classic monsters into sympathetic icons with larger emotional stakes that become the heart of the entire film. Van Helsing, 2004. This film follows a legendary monster hunter named Gabriel Van Helsing, who's a warrior serving the Vatican and is tasked with taking care of all supernatural threats. He's sent to Transylvania to stop Count Dracula, who's trying to bring his undead offspring to life by using the power of Dr. Frankenstein's monster, and he teams up with Anna Valerius, who's the last of a cursed family sworn to destroy Dracula. As they battle vampires, werewolves, and other creatures, Van Helsing uncovers major fragments of his own forgotten past, which gives him a deeper connection to the monsters he hunts. Sadly, Dracula captures Frankenstein's monster to harness its life-giving energy, but Van Helsing and Anna fight to stop him. In the final confrontation, we see Van Helsing transform into a werewolf, as it's the only creature capable of killing Dracula. This is how Van Helsing finally defeats him, but sadly, Anna tragically dies in the process, leaving the monster hunter to continue his lonely mission alone. This movie's version of Dracula is less of a brooding aristocrat and more of a theatrical, near-unstoppable villain obsessed with science, power, and legacy. The vampires here aren't elegant romantics either. They're fast, monstrous, and grotesque, with more gothic horror creature feature edge than the usual seductive version. Not just that, the werewolves, Frankenstein's monster, and other beasts are also pushed into a bigger, more action-driven world that can essentially be described as a gothic battlefield. This movie also has a more comic book kind of feel, with transformation sequences, winged attacks, and a constant sense of visual excess, which truly helped Van Helsing stand out in a sea of monster flicks. Bad Moon, 1996. Inspired by Wayne Smith's novel Thor, this mid-90s werewolf film follows Ted Harrison, a photojournalist who returns from Nepal after being attacked by a mysterious creature. Unbeknownst to his sister Janet and her young son Brett, Ted has become a werewolf and goes on to seek refuge at their secluded home, where he struggles to control his violent transformations. However, the family's protective dog, Thor, senses the danger immediately and becomes increasingly aggressive towards Ted. As the full moon rises, Ted's condition worsens, leading to brutal killings nearby. Thor ultimately becomes the unlikely hero, confronting the werewolf in a tense final battle to protect the family, exposing Ted's secret and ending the threat for good. This is the kind of movie you sit and watch with your friends and a round of booze, because it really is that much of a fun movie to watch. It's honestly crazy good at how bad it is, and it really makes the dog suffer before making it the hero. Dracula, 1931. Given that this film is from the 1930s, this is one of the very first Dracula films ever made, especially because it was produced in the pre-film code era. Here, we meet a mysterious Transylvanian nobleman named Count Dracula, who lures the unsuspecting solicitor, Renfield, to his castle. There, Dracula reveals his true nature as a vampire and enslaves Renfield as his servant. As he travels to England aboard a ship, Dracula leaves a trail of death as he arrives in London to prey upon high society. There, he becomes fixated on Mina Seward and places her under his hypnotic control while draining her life. As strange deaths and behaviors spread, Professor Van Helsing begins to suspect the truth. After recognizing Dracula as a vampire, Van Helsing leads the effort to stop him by uncovering Dracula's lair, where Van Helsing and Mina's fiancé, Jonathan Harker, confront the Count. The film ends as they ultimately destroy him by driving a stake through his heart, freeing Mina from his curse. As one of Universal's early horror classics, Dracula set the tone for countless vampire movies that followed, and more than a monster film, it became a template for Gothic horror itself. Silver Bullet, 1985. Silver Bullet is based on a novella by the famous Stephen King, where we follow a series of brutal killings in the small town of Tarker's Mills. Now, the townspeople initially blame a human murderer, but young Marty Coslaw, a wheelchair-bound boy, suspects something supernatural is at play. During a nighttime outing, Marty encounters a werewolf and injures it by shooting a firework into its eye. Realizing the creature must now be one-eyed in human form, Marty and his sister Jane try to identify the monster and soon discover the killer to be Reverend Lowe, a respected local priest. As fear grips the town, Marty's Uncle Red helps him prepare a special silver bullet, which is the only thing that can kill the beast. In a final confrontation at Marty's home, the werewolf attacks, but Marty uses the silver bullet to kill it, restoring peace back to Tarker's Mills. As you've probably gathered, the disabled kid being the unlikely hero is the true heart of the story, but more than the monster, it's the psychological depth of the film that really keeps you hooked. Dog Soldiers, 2002. This film follows a squad of British soldiers on a training exercise in the Scottish Highlands that quickly turns into a nightmare. After stumbling upon the remains of a Special Forces unit, they quickly realize something inhuman is stalking them as the lone survivor, Captain Ryan, offers very little clarity before the group is attacked by savage, intelligent, and very fast werewolves. As they retreat to a secluded farmhouse, the soldiers fortify themselves alongside Megan, a seemingly helpful zoologist. But when the creatures again lay siege throughout the night, the film becomes a tense battle of endurance with dwindling ammunition, rising panic, and brutal casualties. The ultimate paranoia sets in when it's revealed Megan is the true perpetrator, as she is not only tied to the werewolves, but also transforms into one, thus turning survival into a desperate last-stand fight. By dawn, only one soldier, Cooper, escapes, carrying the scars of a horrifying night that we later see published in a sensational tabloid newspaper as the movie ends. Honestly, this is unlike any werewolf film you've seen before, and more than the blood and gore, it's the loss of soldiers facing an unforeseen enemy on a battleground they just weren't prepared for.
I only wanted to prepare you.
Interview with the Vampire, 1994. Okay, now this one's a personal favorite. Interview with the Vampire follows Louis Dupont du Lac, a grief-stricken plantation owner recounting his life story to a modern-day reporter named Malloy. Apparently, in the late 18th century, Louis was turned into a vampire by the charismatic and ruthless Lestat de Liancourt, who loved to revel in his bloodlust. After his transformation, Louis begins struggling with guilt over killing humans and resists his new nature by feeding only on animals, while Lestat embraces it with cruel delight. However, Lestat doesn't like Louis's choice to abstain from human blood, and so to further bind Louis to him, Lestat turns a dying child named Claudia into a vampire. While Claudia remains physically a child, her mind matures, creating a tragic existence filled with rage and longing. This naturally leads her to form a deep resentment towards Lestat for trapping her in a child's body, because at the end of the day, this trio could only form a fractured family. Eventually, Louis and Claudia rebel, attempting to kill Lestat and escape to Europe. After the duo ends up in Paris, they meet others like them and discover an entire coven of vampires led by Armand. Sadly, their past finally catches up with them, leading to devastating consequences for Claudia, who's executed for breaking vampire laws. Now broken and completely disillusioned, Louis continues his immortal existence alone for many years, but only after destroying the coven in revenge. In the present day, as he recounts his story to Malloy, leaving behind a haunting reflection on loneliness, morality, and the burden of eternal life, he finds out that, albeit in a terrible condition, Lestat is still alive and seeking a new companion. When Lestat asks Louis to join him again, the latter declines and then concludes his interview with Malloy, prompting Malloy to beseech Louis to make him his new vampire companion. Louis is outraged that Malloy has not understood the tale of suffering he's relayed and attacks Malloy to scare him into abandoning the idea. Malloy then runs to his car and takes off while playing the cassette tapes of Louis' interview. The film ends on the Golden Gate Bridge, where Lestat appears and attacks Malloy before taking control of the car. Revived by Malloy's blood, Lestat offers him the choice to become a vampire and continues driving. This movie stands out in particular because it treats vampirism less as horror and more as tragedy. Instead of focusing on action or scares, the film dives deep into immortality, guilt, loneliness, and moral conflict, especially through Louis, who despises what he's become. Wolf, 1994. This lycanthropic horror follows a mild-mannered New York book editor named Will Randall, whose life begins to unravel after he's passed over for a promotion by his ambitious protege, Stuart Swinton. While driving through rural Vermont one night, Will accidentally hits a wolf and is bitten when he goes out to inspect it. Soon after, Will starts to experience heightened senses, renewed confidence, and animalistic instincts. As his suppressed aggression surfaces, he reclaims control at work by directly exposing Stuart's betrayal and winning back his position. He also grows close to Laura Alden, the intelligent and independent daughter of his employer, Raymond Alden. However, Will's transformation only intensifies from here as he becomes increasingly primal, especially during the full moon. Meanwhile, Stuart also gets bitten, and after his transformation, he fully embraces his savage nature. As their rivalry escalates into violence, both men succumb to their wolf instincts. In a final confrontation, Will defeats Stuart in a brutal fight. Following this, he chooses to swallow the hard pill by accepting what he's become and chooses to leave civilization behind. As the movie ends, Will retreats into the wilderness with Laura, who joins him after being bitten as well, suggesting they'll live together as creatures of the wild, free from all human constraint. Now, this one stands out because it reimagines corporate ambition as primal instinct, not just horror, so if you're a corporate slave, this one might just resonate with you. Late Phases, 2014. This movie is about a blind, cantankerous Vietnam War vet named Ambrose McKinley who moves into a quiet retirement community called Crescent Bay with his guide dog. Though he struggles to adjust and keeps people at a distance, including his own son, something far more dangerous lurks in the neighborhood. On his very first night, a neighbor is brutally killed by a mysterious creature. When Ambrose's dog is also attacked, he realizes the killer is no ordinary animal. Soon, another resident is slain exactly 1 month later, and that's when Ambrose deduces the attacks coincide with the full moon, thus pointing to a werewolf. Determined to fight back despite his blindness, Ambrose begins preparing himself as he trains to navigate his home with precision, sets traps, and arms himself with silver bullets. Along the way, he also forms a reluctant bond with a local priest who helps him uncover the identity of the monster. Turns out it was someone from within the community, a man named James Griffin, and as the next full moon rises, Ambrose faces his werewolf form in a brutal close-quarters battle inside his own home. Using his heightened awareness and preparation, he manages to kill the creature, but is unfortunately mortally wounded in the process. The movie ends as Ambrose dies, having reclaimed purpose, leaving behind a legacy of courage and defiance. However, it's important to note that he didn't meet his end from his battle wounds, but had purposefully overdosed himself on medication right before the battle in order to make sure that he didn't go on to live as a werewolf. Fright Night, 1985. In Fright Night, a horror-obsessed teenager named Charlie Brewster becomes convinced that his new neighbor, Jerry Dandridge, is a vampire. After witnessing strange nocturnal activities and a series of disappearances, Charlie tries to warn the police, but naturally no one believes him. A desperate Charlie then turns to Peter Vincent, a washed-up TV horror host and former vampire hunter actor who is initially dismissive, but soon realizes Charlie is telling the truth after encountering Jerry himself. Meanwhile, Charlie's girlfriend Amy and his friend Evil Ed get drawn into the danger, which ends in Ed being turned into a vampire and Amy being later transformed by Jerry. As Jerry's power grows, Charlie and Peter prepare to confront him using traditional vampire weaknesses like holy water, crosses, and sunlight. Their final battle takes place in Jerry's house, where illusions and supernatural strength test their ultimate resolve. In a climactic showdown, Peter regains his courage and helps Charlie destroy Jerry by exposing him to sunlight, causing the vampire to grotesquely decay and die. Following this, Amy is restored to normal and peace returns, even though Charlie is forever changed by the terror he faced. This one's a really fun flick if you ask us. The Wolfman, 2010. The Wolfman tells the story of Lawrence Talbot, a troubled actor who returns to his childhood home after his brother's mysterious death. Now, the Talbot family home is heavy with bad memories, especially because of Lawrence's distant and unsettling father, Sir John, but while trying to uncover what really happened, Lawrence grows close to Gwen, his brother's grieving fiancée. However, things soon take a dark turn when Lawrence is attacked by a strange creature at a gypsy camp. While he survives, the experience leaves him completely changed. Before you know it, he begins to lose control of himself during full moons and starts waking up with no memory of the horrific killings happening around him. As all the suspicion falls on him, an inspector closes in, but the real horror lies closer to home as Lawrence eventually learns that his father is the original monster because he's the one who passed the curse on to him. The story then builds to a brutal and emotional confrontation between father and son as both transform into beasts. Lawrence manages to kill his dad, but ends up fatally wounded. In the end, he dies in Gwen's arms after being finally freed from the curse, leaving behind a tragic story that honestly made me tear up just a little bit.